43 years ago, a group of men saw a creature standing in between a pair of trees, and that wasn't all. They found evidence they believe belonged to Bigfoot.
Some people walk into the wilderness searching for peace. Others come back with footage they can never explain. One man thought he was documenting a simple solo hike through the forests of the Pacific Northwest. A GoPro was strapped backward to his backpack, quietly recording the trail behind him while he walked. He never heard footsteps, never sensed movement, never once looked over his shoulder. But later that night, sitting alone in the glow of his laptop screen, he froze the video frame by frame, and there it was, standing between two trees, watching him leave. Massive, motionless, human-shaped, but wrong in ways his brain struggled to process. The figure didn't chase him, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there in silence as he unknowingly walked away with his back exposed the entire time. That detail terrified him more than anything else, because whatever had been in those woods had made a decision. It chose not to reveal itself. And that question has haunted hikers ever since. How many times has something stood just beyond the trees, watching, while remaining completely unseen? The rainforest outside Tofino, on Vancouver Island's western edge, feels ancient in a way few places still do. Towering Sitka spruce block most of the sunlight, leaving the forest floor trapped beneath shifting green shadows and dripping curtains of moss. Visibility collapses around every bend in the trail. 10 feet ahead can feel like another world. In 2006, a brother and sister were hiking through that corridor when both stopped at the exact same moment. 50 meters ahead, something was standing between the trees. The sister saw it first. At first glance, her mind tried forcing it into something familiar. A person, maybe a bear, but the proportions didn't fit. It stood upright, close to 7 feet tall, with shoulders unnaturally wide and arms hanging too low against its body. And it wasn't moving, not even slightly. The forest itself seemed frozen around it. Her brother later said the silence felt unnatural, like the woods had suddenly stopped breathing. The figure remained there for several seconds, perfectly still in the filtered green light. Then the sister slowly raised her phone to take a picture. The instant the camera came up, the figure moved. Not with panic, not crashing through branches like an animal startled by humans. It simply turned and disappeared into the undergrowth with one smooth, controlled motion, vanishing into the rainforest as if it had rehearsed the exit beforehand. The footage they captured was brief and blurry, just a dark shape slipping between trees before dissolving into green shadow. But what stayed with them wasn't the video. It was the feeling. One of them kept insisting it had to be a bear, but every time he repeated the word, his voice grew quieter. Eventually, neither of them spoke at all, because 50 meters is close enough to recognize posture, close enough to understand size, close enough to know when something doesn't move like anything you've ever seen before. Far north of there, another encounter unfolded on a logging road buried deep in autumn wilderness. A father and son were driving through the mountains together, following a route they'd traveled for years while collecting firewood before winter. The road cut across a valley surrounded by thick timber, washed in late evening sunlight that turned the forest gold. The son was half asleep in the passenger seat when his father suddenly spoke. Quietly, just one word. Look, across the valley, nearly 400 yards away on the opposite ridgeline, something was crossing the road on two legs. The son snapped awake instantly. The figure moved with a long, deliberate stride. Broad shoulders, upright posture, no hesitation, no awkward movement. It walked with the confidence of something completely familiar with the terrain around it, and neither of them could identify it. Not a deer, not a bear, not a person. The son lunged into the back seat, searching for the camcorder, digging through chainsaw cases and heavy tarps without taking his eyes off the ridge. By the time he finally hit record, the figure was already stepping off the road and disappearing behind a pile of rocks near the tree line. The footage lasted less than a second, but the silence afterward lasted far longer. Neither spoke during most of the drive home. That night, they replayed the clip over and over on a tiny fold-out screen, searching for some detail that would make the image logical. When they uploaded it online, they didn't claim it was Bigfoot. They didn't claim anything at all. They asked a single question. What in the hell was that? No one answered it. And then came the audio recording that disturbed experienced outdoorsmen more than any blurry photograph ever could. A mountain hiker was walking a wooded trail with his dog when his camera accidentally captured something hidden deep within the forest below him. At first, the recording sounded normal. Wind moving through branches, boots crunching across dry needles, the dog breathing heavily nearby. Then something else emerged from the trees. A sound. Low, guttural, sustained. It wasn't a wolf howl, wasn't a cougar scream, wasn't elk. The hiker had spent his entire life in those mountains. He knew every animal call that belonged there. This didn't belong. The sound rolled uphill through the forest canopy like something alive inside the darkness itself. Deep, wet, almost human, but distorted in a way that triggered something instinctive in the body. The man stopped walking immediately, not because he chose to, because his body stopped for him. His survival instincts reacted before his thoughts could catch up. On the recording, his voice sounds hollow when he finally speaks. What the hell was that? He never investigated the source, never called out, never stepped off the trail. He simply stood there listening while the dog pressed tightly against his leg, both of them staring into trees the camera never fully captured. Whatever made the sound remained hidden, but for the first time in his life, the hiker encountered something in those woods he could not explain away. And deeper in North Carolina's Burkhead Mountains, another man would discover footprints that completely shattered his understanding of what might exist in America's forests. He had entered the national forest believing none of these stories were real. By sunrise the next morning, he was running for his life through the dark. Rain had soaked the Burkhead Mountains the night before. By the time the hiker entered the forest on May 13, 2017, the trails had turned into slick ribbons of Carolina clay, every step sliding slightly beneath his boots. The parking area behind him had been completely empty. No voices, no campers, no other vehicles, just miles of wet wilderness ahead. He hiked nearly 10 miles into the mountains before noticing the tracks. They crossed directly over the trail in front of him. At first, his brain refused to process what he was looking at. The impressions were too large, too clean, too human. He crouched beside them slowly. Each footprint measured somewhere between 15 and 20 inches long, deeply pressed into the soft red clay as if something incredibly heavy had passed through only hours earlier. 5 distinct toes, a visible arch, human-shaped, but impossibly large. The tracks emerged from dense brush on one side of the trail, crossed the path, and vanished back into the forest on the other side without a single sign of hesitation. The hiker photographed them carefully, convincing himself there had to be a rational explanation. Someone playing a prank. Oversized molds, maybe distorted bear tracks altered by rain. Anything except the conclusion slowly creeping into the back of his mind. That night, alone in his tent beneath pounding rain, the sounds began. At first it was distant, then closer. High-pitched screams echoed through the forest, followed by low, guttural noises that sounded disturbingly organic, like something breathing through liquid. The sounds bounced between the hillsides until it became impossible to tell where they were coming from. One direction, then another. Then all around him at once. The man lay frozen inside the darkness, staring upward while rain hammered against the nylon overhead. Every logical explanation collapsed one by one. No known animal sounded like that. And whatever was out there sounded enormous. His breathing became shallow. His hand found his weapon instinctively, while the noises continued circling through the woods beyond his tent. Finally, panic took over. He switched on his lantern, tore apart the campsite with shaking hands, and began hiking 10 miles back to his vehicle alone in the middle of the night. The screams followed him for nearly a mile before finally fading into the distance. Years later, he still says the same thing. The footprints frightened him, but the sounds broke him. And then there was the snow. In 2014, a group of children were playing near a treehouse after fresh snowfall covered the woods behind their homes. One of them was filming casually on a phone while the others moved through the trees laughing. Then the camera caught something moving. A dark figure crossed between the trunks upright on 2 legs before vanishing from sight. The children immediately assumed it was a bear. That was the safe answer, the comforting answer. But when they walked closer to where the figure had disappeared, they found tracks pressed clearly into the fresh powder. And suddenly the explanation stopped making sense. The impressions looked human. Bare human feet, large enough to dwarf any adult footprint nearby. 5 toes, a heel, a defined arch, no shoe patterns, no claws, no animal markings of any kind. Just enormous barefoot tracks leading through freezing snow. Investigators later analyzed the video using objects nearby for scale estimation. Their conclusion placed the figure at roughly 8 feet tall. But what disturbed people most wasn't the size. It was the temperature. Snow that cold should have been unbearable to bare skin within seconds. Yet whatever left those prints crossed the woods barefoot without hesitation. The tracks remained visible for 3 full days. And unlike costume hoaxes, there were no boot impressions anywhere nearby to suggest someone had faked them. Only footprints appearing where no human should have been walking at all. By now, the encounters were beginning to form a pattern. A towering figure between rainforest trees. Something crossing a distant ridge on 2 legs. Unknown vocalizations deep in isolated mountains. Massive footprints pressed into wet clay. Bare feet moving through freezing snow. But the encounters still ahead would push beyond strange sightings, because some witnesses didn't just feel watched. They felt hunted. Deep in eastern Oregon's Hoodoo Creek wilderness, one hiker spent 3 days realizing something in the forest was tracking his movements intentionally. The first day, he noticed a dark figure moving downhill through thick brush, far faster than should have been possible across that terrain. The second day, something reddish and upright paced him through the trees above his campsite, staying just out of sight while matching his movement perfectly. By day 3, he no longer believed he was alone. That afternoon, while filling a water bottle beside a dry creek bed, something happened that changed the entire encounter. A branch came flying out of the trees. Not falling. Thrown. It spun through the air and slammed into rocks only feet away from him. The hiker froze and looked uphill. Nothing visible. Only dense timber and shifting sunlight between trunks. Then a second branch came down. Closer this time. Close enough that he felt the impact through the ground beneath him. The realization hit instantly. Something above him wasn't simply making noise. It was aiming. Using elevation. Testing distance. The hiker slowly stood there with water spilling unnoticed from the bottle in his hand, while staring into trees that refused to reveal what was hidden inside them. That night, the screams started again. They rose from deep within the canyon below his tent, echoing upward through the darkness. He left at first light and never returned. But one of the most unsettling encounters didn't happen deep in wilderness at all. It happened only 40 feet from someone's home. Late one October night in Washington state, 2 brothers stood outside studying thermal footage from a handheld imaging unit. On the screen, glowing bright against the cold hillside behind their property, stood the unmistakable heat signature of a massive living body. Head, shoulders, upper torso, perfectly upright. The brothers stared in silence. The nearest house sat half a mile away through thick timber. The air was cold enough to see their breath. And yet, on the thermal display, something enormous radiated body heat from the slope below them. They ruled out deer immediately. Wrong shape, wrong posture. They considered bear next, until the figure shifted slightly. Too upright, too broad, too still. When the heat signature finally disappeared into darkness, the brothers waited until sunrise before walking to the exact location. That's when they found the footprints. Large, deep, far wider than their own. Using measurement poles and terrain markers, they estimated the figure stood roughly 7 feet tall with shoulders nearly 4 feet across. And unlike blurry videos or eyewitness stories, thermal imaging introduced a terrifying possibility. Heat signatures don't capture costumes. They capture living organisms, which meant something warm-blooded and massive had been standing in silence beside their property while they watched it through the screen. That night, one of the brothers slept beside the thermal unit, with it pointed directly toward the back window. He didn't review the footage again until morning. Because once you've seen something impossible standing in the darkness never feels empty again. The carpenter never saw it. That's the part that stays with people. He had walked that forest trail dozens of times before. Quiet solo hikes through familiar woods where every sound eventually fades into routine. Birds overhead, boots against dirt, wind moving through branches. Nothing unusual happened that day. No strange noises, no movement in the trees, no feeling of being followed. A GoPro sat mounted backward on the frame of his backpack, recording the trail behind him out of habit more than purpose. The lens pointed into the forest he had already passed through, while his attention stayed fixed ahead. Hours later, back home, he loaded the footage onto his laptop. At first, he almost missed it. Then he paused the frame. Behind him, partially hidden between two trunks, stood a massive figure motionless in the woods, watching him. The proportions looked wrong immediately. Too broad through the shoulders, too tall to be mistaken for a normal person standing that deep in the timber. It blended so perfectly into the shadows that the carpenter had walked within yards of it without noticing anything at all, and the figure never moved. That detail disturbed him more than if it had charged. It simply stood there observing him with complete stillness while he unknowingly exposed his back the entire time. No aggression, no vocalization, no attempt to chase him, just awareness. The carpenter replayed the footage over and over, searching for some mistake, a lighting trick, a tree stump, anything that would turn the image back into something ordinary. But each replay made the feeling worse, because whatever stood there appeared to understand exactly what it was doing. Hidden, silent, patient. That night he shut the laptop and sat alone in darkness for a very long time. And suddenly, every forest trail he had ever walked felt different. Because every hiker eventually turns their back to the trees. In Florida's Lettuce Lake Park, another witness recorded something equally disturbing. But this time, the figure didn't stay hidden. It moved directly through open swamp water beneath hanging curtains of Spanish moss. The afternoon air was thick with humidity, heavy enough to taste. Black water stretched beneath ancient cypress trees, while insects droned endlessly through the heat. Then something upright entered the frame. At first, the visitor filming assumed it was a bear. That explanation lasted only seconds. The creature moved through the swamp on two legs, with long, swinging arms and rolling shoulders that looked disturbingly human. Its movements were controlled and purposeful, nothing like the awkward motion of an animal wandering through water. At one point, it bent down and appeared to pull something from beneath the swamp's dark surface. The man filming should have stopped recording. Every instinct told him to leave. But he couldn't. Later, he admitted there was a moment where his mind understood something before his logic did. The realization that he might be looking at something he would never be able to explain afterward. A park ranger later reviewed the footage personally, and his reaction shocked people. He stated directly that the figure was not a bear. The body proportions were wrong. The arms extended too low. The shoulders rotated independently in ways inconsistent with known animal movement. Then came the moment viewers still debate today. The figure turned its head toward the camera and slowly disappeared beneath the water, completely underwater. Gone. Bears wade through swamps. They splash. They swim. But they do not silently submerge themselves beneath black water and vanish without resurfacing. Locals immediately connected the footage to old legends surrounding Florida's skunk ape, a swamp-dwelling creature reported for generations across the state's interior forests. The ranger had spent years identifying wildlife inside that park. He later admitted one thing that unsettled everyone who heard it. He had never seen anything move like that before. But perhaps the most unsettling footage ever captured came from deep wilderness near Alabama's Little River. A hiker entered a clearing and suddenly stopped. Ahead of him, resting calmly atop a fallen tree, sat a massive hair-covered figure. And unlike nearly every other encounter, this one didn't run. The hiker's hands shook violently while filming. His breathing became so shallow he could hear blood pounding behind his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around and leave immediately. But something about the figure's behavior froze him in place. It simply sat there, watching, completely calm. The visible details stunned viewers after the footage surfaced online. Thick, muscular arms, broad chest, heavy dark fur covering the body, and a face that seemed trapped somewhere between human and primate. Not animal, not fully human, something in between. The proportions looked wrong for a costume, too natural, too balanced. The posture lacked the exaggerated movement hoaxers usually perform for cameras. This figure showed no interest in performing at all. It behaved as though the forest belonged to it, as though the hiker filming was the intruder. Researchers analyzed the footage frame by frame for years without reaching consensus. Some insisted it had to be fake. Others argued the anatomy didn't match any known suit design. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. The stillness was terrifying. Every encounter before this involved something fleeing into shadows the moment humans appeared. This one remained seated in full view without fear. No aggression. No panic. No urgency to escape. Just patient awareness. Like a creature completely confident nothing in those woods could threaten it. And maybe that's the detail connecting every encounter on this list. Not violence. Not attacks. But observation. Again and again, witnesses describe the same feeling. The unbearable realization that something hidden in the wilderness had been watching them long before they became aware of it. A figure standing silently between rainforest trees. A shape crossing distant ridgelines at dusk. Unknown screams echoing through mountains at night. Footprints appearing where no human should exist. Thermal signatures glowing beyond backyard fences. Something submerged beneath black swamp water. And a creature sitting calmly on a fallen tree, staring back without fear. Maybe every story has a rational explanation. Maybe every witness simply misunderstood what they saw. But forests have always hidden things from us. That's what makes them forests. And somewhere tonight, a lone hiker is walking a silent trail with no idea that beyond the reach of the flashlight, something may already be standing there, watching, waiting for him to pass.